And the question is, which Soviet leader was the best looking?
I don't really have an opinion about that. That's not the kind of thing that I deal with.
I make the money, man. I roll the nickels. The game's mine. I deal the cards.
I close my eyes and seize it. I clench my fists and beat it. I light my torch and burn it. I am the beast I worship. I close my eyes and seize it. I clench my fists and beat it. I light my torch and burn it. I am the beast I worship. And I know soon come my turbo and my...
Witam towarzyszy, to jest Polinkarz, and today I'm going to be doing an interview with Professor Grover Furr. He is a very well-known writer on Soviet history, particularly in the Stalin era, and I'm very excited to ask you questions that I've collected from my fans. So, my fans were asking, what are some of your thoughts on Beria?
Well, that's actually a very good question. Beria is the figure in Soviet history who has been slandered and maligned the most. And it was done by Khrushchev, and it is very hard to find material to support the accusations that were made during Khrushchev's time about Beria. He was accused of all kinds of very bad things. There isn't really any hard evidence to support those accusations. There's another, so that's one big problem. Now, Beria's wife and son, his son was named Sergo, survived him. Sergo just died in the 90s at some point, and he wrote a biography of his father, and he also was interviewed. It sort of has an autobiography kind of work, which is an interview of him. And these are available in Russian. And he stoutly denies that his father was guilty of any of the crimes and misdemeanors and immoral actions and so forth that the Khrushchevites accused Beria of. Although she didn't write anything formally, Beria's wife also denied them. Now, the picture is somewhat complicated by the fact that the official story, which is still the official story, ever since Khrushchev, was that Beria was arrested on June 26, 1953, interrogated. Lots of other people were arrested and interrogated too, and then finally put on trial with, I think, 7 of his former top MVD men. In December 1953, they were all convicted and all shot. Some years ago, I got the microfilm of Pravda and saved the pages that dealt with the trial of Beria. And there's very, very little. There's even the photographs are such that you can't really recognize anyone. So the question has arisen in Russia too, whether Beria was in fact arrested at all or was perhaps shot, perhaps by mistake, on June 26, 1953, and then a big charade carried out to make it look as though he were arrested. Back in the early years of this century, in the 2000s, there were a number of books on Beria. In fact, it was called the Beria Boom. A number of books on Beria appeared, and one was by a guy named Sukhomlin called Who Are You, Lavrentiy Beria? It's in Russian. Sukhomlin claims that he has gotten a number of the documents that were from the KGB for the dealing with Beria's arrest, including the mugshot, and he reprints them in his book. The mugshot doesn't look anything like Beria. It's somebody else. It also doesn't look like a mugshot. So Amy Knight, who is an anti-communist American historian of some repute, published a book on Beria 25 years ago or so, something like that, back in the 90s. And she doesn't really contradict the mainstream view, but she does record the allegation that Beria was perhaps killed on June 26, 1953. So there is no evidence that he was guilty of all of these various crimes. But apparently the Khrushchev people, it seems as though the Khrushchev people went to a lot of trouble to fabricate interrogations, letters from Beria, to make it appear as though he really was arrested, there really was an investigation, he really was put on trial, and so forth and so on. But it's all very shaky, and I'm not convinced. If there were some good evidence, I could be convinced either way. As it is, it's far from certain. So therefore, it's kind of like the Katyn massacre, which we'll talk about later. Like other topics, it's kind of a sign of respectability, a shibboleth or an oath of loyalty. If you question whether Beria was actually put on trial, whether these documents are actually from him and so forth, then you're beyond the pale. You're outside of the mainstream. You're just not supposed to question things like that. So in either case, the question is, why was Beria either arrested or perhaps, and then tried and shot, or perhaps shot right there on June 26, 1953. And there is absolutely no respectable reason that was ever given. All kinds of wild charges were made. Khrushchev and even Molotov both said that at the time that he was arrested, they didn't have any evidence. So they hated Beria. Khrushchev and company hated him. It's not at all clear why. In my 2005 article, Stalin and the Struggle for Democratic Reform, which is on my webpage, the second part of it deals with, this period. I summarized what some of the Russian historians were saying at that time. One possibility is that Beria wanted to return to Stalin's program of the mid-1930s to try to effect a kind of a democratic electoral system where the role of the party would be restricted and the government of the country would be turned over to the Soviets, which would be elected in secret elections, with contested elections, and so forth. Maybe there's, I guess, some evidence that that is the case. But we really, really don't know for sure, because this is a kind of hush-hush affair. And so that's about Beria's death. Now, prior to his death, he seems to have been an effective leader in KVD. He took over after Yezhov, released a lot of people who had been improperly arrested and imprisoned on false charges. He oversaw the trials and executions or prison sentences for Yezhov and a lot of his men. After the war, he headed the Soviet effort to build the A-bomb. And there's some testimony from people who knew about that he was effective in managing that very important and very large-scale project. He was named, when Stalin died, the day Stalin died, March 5th, 1953, there was a kind of coup d'etat in the Soviet Communist Party. The old Politburo that had existed up to the time of the 19th Party Congress in October 52, that evidently stood around Stalin's body as he was dying, and reconstituted themselves as effectively the same old Politburo, only now it was called the Presidium, because the name was changed at the 19th Party Congress. So they undid the decisions of the 19th Party Congress, and they undid a lot more than just that one aspect of those decisions. So that's an important topic that has not attracted enough attention. Then Beria was appointed head of both the Ministry of Internal Affairs, the successor to the old NKVD, and the Ministry of State Security, the old NKGB, which had split back in the 40s. And these people, of course, Stalin was dead. Stalin had just died. So these people approved that, Khrushchev among them. This was in March the 5th. And by June the 26th, they either killed him or arrested him without evidence and then judicially murdered him. So what happened? That's a very good question. There is no fully satisfactory answer to that question. But nothing like this had ever happened under Stalin. It really was, in a manner of speaking, a coup d'etat, and that is to say, the arrest of Beria. And there was a kind of coup d'etat, although it was within the party, back there on March the 5th, 53, at Stalin's bedside. So this raises all kinds of very, very interesting questions. I'm sorry if I've talked a little bit too long about this, but the whole Beria issue is somehow or other at the heart of what happened once Stalin died. Something happened on June 26, 1953. Either Beria was shot, although they've never admitted that, or he was arrested and they didn't have any evidence against him. They just threw him in prison. Then in a couple of weeks after that, at the beginning of July, there was a Central Committee plenum. And that has been published. In fact, somewhere or other it's been published in English, but don't ask me where, because I can't remember that off the top of my head. But it's been published in Russian too. And it makes for very interesting reading. This is a whole Central Committee plenum called specifically and solely just to attack Beria. That's all they did. Everybody stood up, everybody who spoke stood up and said bad things about Beria, mostly having really no content, just insults. Really an amazing performance.
So the next question I have for you is, how do you respond to the argument that the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact paved the way for World War II? Basically that if Stalin didn't sign the pact with Hitler, then Hitler would never have invaded Poland in the first place.
I don't know, does anybody say that? Okay, I got it. Well, I did write about this at quite great length and Blood Lies. What happened was that the Soviets really wanted to have a mutual defense pact, which they were calling collective security. That was the name that was given to this effort. A mutual defense pact with Britain, France, and Poland, so that in the event that Germany attacked any of them, all the rest would attack Germany. The Poles would not hear of it. The Polish foreign minister said that they would never permit a Soviet soldier on Polish territory. And of course, the Soviets would have had to move across Polish territory in order to get to Germany, because they had no common border at the time. There were negotiations in Moscow. The British and French sent negotiators. The Poles didn't bother. The British negotiator, it turned out, had no authority to make any agreement. And in fact, we have the documents from the British government that told him to drag the whole thing out and delay it. Of course, he didn't have not that he had the authority to do anything else, but just to drag it out. That's pretty amazing that we have that material, but we do. And that makes it appear as though the British were carrying on this negotiation with the Soviets in order to intimidate the Germans, in order to sort of send a signal to the Germans that you'd better make a deal with us, another deal, maybe like Munich, or we'll make a deal with the Soviets. But anyway, they didn't want to deal with the Soviets. They didn't want to deal with the Soviets. And the Soviets, as is well known, has been reported in the press, Stalin was ready to put 1 million men into the field against Germany if they had a mutual defense pact, if they had this kind of a tripartite agreement between France, Britain, and the United States. France, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Actually, it would have to be 4 parts. The Poles would have to join in. So that didn't work. The British obviously didn't want it. They didn't give their representative any authority to sign one. The Poles would have nothing to do with it. So the Soviets had no allies, no allies. They had no reason to think that if Germany attacked them, Britain and France, to say nothing of Poland, wouldn't join with Germany and attack them too. So the Soviets still had no allies. They signed a non-aggression pact with Germany, which was the best they could get. The non-aggression pact said that they agreed not to attack each other. The Soviet Union would not get involved in a war if Germany attacked Poland, or that was who was going to get attacked. The Soviet Union would not get involved in the war. They were far-sighted enough, the Soviets, to have a technical agreement, which came along a little bit later, for exchange of technical information and also trade, and also to have a clause that gave them a sphere of influence in all of what was then Eastern Poland. In other words, the Germans could not come up to the Soviet border if they conquered the Poles. They would have to only go up to the Vistula, which is the river in which Warsaw is on the west bank of, right?
Yeah,
so basically the middle of the country. Yeah, you're from Poland, so you know.
Yeah.
All right. Okay, so they could go up to roughly the Vistula. Okay, half the country would still be left in the Soviet sphere of influence, which was good because it kept the Wehrmacht, it kept the German army several hundred kilometers away from the Polish border, from the Soviet border, from the 1939 Soviet border. Now that's the facts, and they're all very well documented everywhere. In order to say that somehow or other the Soviet Union facilitated World War II, you have to overlook an awful lot. There's the phony war. Don't forget, the British and the French had, right after the Soviets signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, the British and the French and the Poles signed a mutual defense pact. But when Poland was invaded, the British and the French did not attack the Germans. They didn't do it. There was a small incursion in the center of France, and then the French withdrew. So the British and the French basically left Poland to be conquered by Hitler. Now, what does that mean? You know, from the Soviets' point of view, what does that mean? The first thing it meant was that clearly the British and the French did not mind if Hitler took over Poland. And why wouldn't they mind that, since Poland was allied with them? Soviets certainly interpreted that as the British and the French continuing to encourage Hitler to move to the east. They weren't going to do anything to oppose him if he moved east, that is, towards the Soviet Union. They really wanted a war with really wanted Hitler and the Soviet Union to fight it out. That's exactly what the Soviets didn't want. They didn't want to be the only country fighting against Hitler, with the danger that the British and the French might join in with Hitler. So that's the facts, but I have discovered, I guess you have too, that they're not well known. I document them thoroughly in Blood Lies, but these facts are largely obscured, particularly among people who are on the left, who listen to, the anti-communist version of things and would like to blame the Soviets for what was really the fault of the British and the French, the Allies. By the way, when the Soviets occupied eastern Poland, they were only retaking the land which Poland had taken from them in the Russo-Polish War of 1919 to 1921. by the Treaty of Riga, which the Soviet Russia signed because they were exhausted and couldn't fight anymore. The Soviets gave up Western Ukraine and Western Belarus to Poland. The Polish government then proceeded to send settlers, Polish, lots of them being Polish government officials or Polish soldiers, to settle, that is to Polonize, as the word goes, these areas, because there weren't a lot of Poles in those areas. And they repressed the civil rights and religious and educational and linguistic rights of the Belarusians, Ukrainians, and Jews very severely in those areas. So when the Soviets came into Eastern Poland, Western Belarus, and Western Ukraine, they were welcomed by the population. But the idea that somehow or other Hitler would not have attacked Poland if the Soviet Union hadn't signed the pact, the Soviet Union would not have. Soviet Union wanted to sign a pact with the British and the French, and the British and the French wouldn't do it. Now, I think that the Soviets were lucky. That is, in this respect. If they had signed a mutual defense treaty with the Soviet Union, if Britain, France, and Poland had signed a mutual defense treaty with the Soviet Union, so that they were all committed to attack Germany if Germany attacked Poland, let's say. What makes us think that the British and the French would have lived up to their part of the bargain? They didn't live up to it when they had a treaty with Poland. They didn't attack Germany when Poland was invaded and then conquered. Why would they have attacked Germany if the Soviet Union had gotten into the fight? So my guess is they wouldn't have done that. They would have stabbed the Soviets in the back just like they stabbed the Poles in the back, and probably a lot happier because they hated the Soviets, whereas they didn't hate the Poles in the same way. So I think that the attempt to pin World War II on the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact pretty obviously comes from the post-1989 Ukraine and Poland. They would like to blame the Soviet Union for all of this because it's embarrassing to blame the Allies, although they do, if pushed, blame Britain and France for not doing more. The people that really should be blamed, of course, are the Polish government. If the Polish government at the time had agreed to a mutual defense treaty, then there would have been one. But as I said, in a way, they did the Soviets a favor, because my guess is the British and the French would not have lived up to that treaty, and the Soviets would have been left, along with Poland, to fight the Germans alone. There's also the chance, the possibility, that Germany and Poland would have gotten together to attack the Soviet Union. That was certainly a possibility a year earlier. Whether it was still a possibility in August 1939, maybe not. Maybe not.
Considering the joint invasion of Czech Republic. So.
Well, yeah, that's right. Hungary and Poland took little pieces of the of Czechoslovakia. So, of course, that. I think it was Churchill in somewhere in those volumes of the Second World War, who he calls Poland the jackal, who comes and cleans up the bits after the lion is finished, and that was his way of referring to Poland's taking over part of Silesia from from Czechoslovakia when Germany took the Sudetenland.
Yeah.
So the Soviets were the only power that acted properly in the pre-war period. In fact, Litvinov, one of the Soviet negotiators at the time, I believe it was Litvinov, but I could look it up, said that we are the only power that is acting properly in this crucial situation. So, and he was right. The Soviets were the only ones who acted properly. The rest of the powers did not. Winston Churchill, I should just say this, approved when the Soviets entered what was then Eastern Poland and moved up to the Vistula River, moved up to the line that had been decided upon by the Germans and the Soviets. As took the the sphere of influence. He approved. He said, and it was quoted in the New York Times as saying, it's in the interest of the Allies as well as in the interest of the Soviets that they did this. This is good. Not he didn't regard that as invading Poland or anything like that.
Right. I mean,
but that's Go ahead.
I mean, yeah. Even today in Poland, like there's so much whitewashing of history where.
Oh, sure.
Like I've heard so many Polish people say that the USSR is responsible for World War II and nonsense like.
Yeah.
The Soviets didn't save us in World War II. It was the Allies, which is absolutely absurd considering that the Allies never even landed in Poland during World War II. But
no, they never did. So how would the Allies save them?
Exactly.
I know, but, that's right. I mean, those kinds of statements are obviously a reflection of propaganda, but people can't back them up with any sort of facts. By the way, the Jews in Poland, the Jews generally reject the idea, which is the Polish nationalist narration today, that they were not liberated by the Red Army. The Jews say, yes, we were liberated by the Red Army. The Red Army liberated the Polish, the German prisoner, the German concentration camps and death camps in Poland. And not only that, the Soviets, the Soviet partisans accepted Jews into the ranks of the partisans. The Red Army, when it came into Poland, accepted Jews into the ranks of the Red Army, whereas the Polish National Army, Armia Krajowa, killed Jews. They were fanatically anti-Semitic. There are stories. I mentioned this in Blood Lies some years ago when I was researching that. I was reading all this stuff. There were memoirs of Poles who had escaped to the woods and then gone back to fight in the Warsaw Uprising. I'm not talking about the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. That was 43, but the Warsaw Uprising, August, September 44, to fight alongside the Armia Krajowa, the Polish nationalists, and were getting shot in the back because they were Jewish, because the Polish nationalists, supported by the government in exile in London, were so fanatically anti-Semitic. And a number of Jews who fought side by side with the Poles in the Warsaw Uprising did so only because they changed their names. They had Polish-sounding names. They didn't use their Jewish names. And I quote at least one of them in there as saying, well, at least when we joined the Red Army, we could use our real names, our Jewish names, instead of. They had to use Polish-sounding names if they were going to fight beside the Armia Krajowa, because the Home Army was so vehemently anti-Semitic.
Yeah, I mean, it's even worse when considering, because, in Poland there were two partisan groups. You had the Polskie Armia Krajowa, and then you have the Polskie Armia Ludowa.
Yeah, the Armia Ludowa, yeah.
Yeah, and so. And it's terrible because there are two streets in Warsaw named after the two groups, and they're currently discussing renaming the one that's named after the Armia Ludowa, which is complete bullshit. Like considering everything you just mentioned,
Yeah, right. That's right, and they've been talking about doing that for years, but I'm sure at some point or other they'll get around to doing it.
Yeah, and also they're also wanting to. Actually, I think they already did it. They deranked all of the communist era generals back to private.
Yeah, it's all of this kind of stuff. This is but it's not just the current government, which I think is right wing even by Polish nationalist standards, but all the Polish governments since 1989 or 1990, whenever it was.
Piłsudski.
It's all the Polish governments have been horribly anti-communist, and what else?
Very nationalist in nature. Yeah.
Yeah. So the fact that they've continued to drift as far, farther and farther to the right is no surprise.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, and of course it's nothing to be ashamed of if you look at the evidence, but of course not too many people do. There are some decent books in English published by Western scholars about this stuff, There's a very good book in German that came out a couple of years ago on the collection of essays on the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact. But, this is scholarly stuff. That's why I repeated a lot of this, I sort of tried to synthesize and repeat a lot of this material in Blood Lies, because it is so little understood.
Yeah.
A lot of this anti-communist, anti-Soviet, anti-Stalin stuff is, it's out there because nobody ever questions it. Nobody ever tries to refute it, so that many people just think, well, it must be the case. But in fact, it isn't the case. It's just that it's not considered appropriate to question anti-Soviet, anti-Stalin statements, almost no matter what they are.
Right. The next question I have for you is, how do you respond to the accusation that Stalin lied at the Yalta conference about allowing free elections to take place in Poland?
I don't have much, I have not, my response would be, I don't know. I have not studied the Yalta conference. I have concentrated on the 1930s. I'm not saying yes, and I'm not saying no. I haven't studied it. I don't know if the people who say this have studied it either. What the Soviets wanted before the war and after the war were not neutral. They wanted on their borders governments that were allied with the Soviet Union, that would sign, treaties of alliance with the Soviet Union. They wanted allies. They had no allies up until 1941, and they wanted some allies. They also would have certainly settled for, the Popular Front governments which were friendly to the communists, where communists took part in them, but were not the sole force, or maybe not even the dominant force. In retrospect, looking back on it, that was naive. Even in the 30s, when the Popular Front position was inaugurated at the 7th Congress of the Comintern in 1935, I think, it never was very successful. There were simply not enough, particularly in the 30s, there were simply not enough bourgeois political parties in Europe that were willing to have coalition governments or governments of national unity, Popular Front governments with communist parties. They just weren't willing to do it. So the only alternative to having hostile governments on their borders was to have actively pro-Soviet governments on their borders. But I think in all of the Eastern European countries, including in Poland, now we're getting into the Khrushchev period, which is beyond the field that I study. Mm-hmm. They really wanted, parties like in Germany, the Socialist Unity Party. There was a similar party in Poland. They did not want the communist parties to be the governing party. They wanted coalition parties with Social Democrats, if there were some Social Democrats. They wanted to share power with the bourgeoisie. They did not want to, confiscate all the lands of the peasants. They didn't want social revolutions. They didn't think that any of these parties could pull it off. They were not ready for that. So they wanted what they could get. They would not stand for hostile parties. Now, how that played out in Poland as a result of Yalta, I really don't know. But that's what the Soviets wanted. Perhaps that was impossible, but that's what they wanted. And they certainly did not put communist parties as such in power in these countries. But that having been said, I really don't know the details of the post-war period.
All right.
Бабушка трубочку давать, жить не желает.